The night he made her homeless. He believed he was ending her story. Rain hammered against the windshield as Sarah Mitchell sat motionless in the driver's seat of her aging sedan, staring at the apartment building she had called home for 11 years. Water streamed down the glass in crooked lines, blurring the warm lights glowing from the windows above. Somewhere on the 8th floor, Daniel Mitchell was probably pouring himself a drink, convinced the hardest part was finally over. The divorce papers had been signed that afternoon. The lawyers had shaken hands. The judge had approved the settlement. And Sarah had walked away with 2 suitcases, a nearly empty checking account, and nowhere to go. The digital clock on the dashboard flashed 10:47 p.m. Outside, the October wind swept fallen leaves across the parking lot. Inside the car, the air felt cold enough to sting. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the back seat. 2 suitcases, a folded blanket, a small cardboard box containing family photographs she had not been able to leave behind. 11 years reduced to a few possessions that could fit inside an old sedan. She closed her eyes for a moment, not because she wanted to cry. The tears had already come earlier that day when she carried the final box down the hallway while strangers pretended not to stare. Now there was only exhaustion, the kind that settled deep into a person's bones. Her phone vibrated. A text message appeared from a friend she had not spoken to in months. "Are you okay?" Sarah stared at the screen for several seconds before typing 2 simple words. "I will be." She sent the message and placed the phone face down. She did not know if the statement was true. At that moment, she did not know where she would sleep tomorrow night. She did not know how she would rebuild a life that seemed to have collapsed in a single afternoon. Yet something inside her refused to disappear. The rain continued falling. Across the parking lot, a luxury SUV pulled into the building entrance. A smiling couple stepped out beneath an umbrella and hurried toward the lobby. Sarah watched them disappear through the glass doors. For a brief second, she remembered when she and Daniel had first moved into the building. They had been younger then, hopeful. They spent weekends walking through furniture stores and arguing about paint colors. They talked about vacations they would take and dreams they would build together. Somewhere along the way, those conversations stopped. Success arrived. Promotions arrived. Distance arrived. And eventually, so did the silence. Sarah opened her eyes and started the engine. The fuel gauge sat just above empty. She calculated the remaining miles automatically. Enough for a few days if she was careful. Maybe longer. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove through the wet streets of Chicago without a destination. Neon signs reflected off puddles. Traffic lights painted the pavement red and green. The city felt enormous tonight. Endless. Unforgiving. Shortly after midnight, she parked near a 24-hour grocery store. The lot was well lit. Safe enough. She reclined the driver's seat slightly and wrapped the blanket around herself. The position was uncomfortable. Her neck already hurt. Yet she knew sleep would eventually come because exhaustion always won. Before closing her eyes, she looked up through the windshield at the dark sky. A strange thought entered her mind. Daniel believed he had taken everything. The apartment, the stability, the future they once shared. Maybe he had. But as Sarah sat alone beneath the harsh parking lot lights, listening to distant traffic and rain tapping softly against the roof, she realized there was one thing he had not taken. Tomorrow. Tomorrow still belonged to her. She did not know what it would look like. She did not know how difficult it would become. She did not know that years later people would speak her name with admiration instead of pity. She did not know that the same city now watching her struggle would one day watch her rise. All she knew was that the night felt cold, the future felt uncertain, and the road ahead seemed impossibly long. Yet when she finally closed her eyes inside that old sedan, homeless and alone, a small spark remained alive beneath the wreckage of everything she had lost. And sometimes, a single spark is enough to start an empire. The first week passed one day at a time. Sarah Mitchell quickly learned that survival was less dramatic than people imagined. It was not a single heroic moment. It was 100 small decisions made while nobody was watching. Every morning, she woke up inside her sedan before sunrise, folding the blanket neatly before anyone noticed she had spent the night there. She used the restroom inside grocery stores, gas stations, and public libraries. She learned which parking lots were quiet and which security guards asked questions. The city that once felt familiar now revealed an entirely different face. By day, Chicago moved with confidence and purpose. By night, it belonged to people trying to disappear. Sarah became one of them. 3 weeks after the divorce, the weather grew colder. The mornings carried a sharp wind that slipped through the seams of her coat. One afternoon, she sat inside a library near downtown, scrolling through job listings while trying to ignore the ache in her back. Her savings had nearly vanished. The settlement Daniel's attorneys negotiated left little room for mistakes, and life seemed determined to present a new expense every few days. Yet Sarah kept applying. Receptionist positions, administrative assistant jobs, customer service roles, anything that offered stability. Most employers never responded. Those who did often looked at her resume and asked questions she struggled to answer. What had she been doing recently? Why was there a gap in employment? Why had she left her previous situation? Sarah answered politely and left with the same practiced smile. Then she returned to her car and started over. One evening she parked near Lake Michigan and watched the water darken beneath a gray sky. The city lights flickered to life across the shoreline. Couples walked together along the path. Office workers hurried toward train stations. The world continued moving forward without noticing her struggle. Oddly enough, that realization brought comfort. Her pain felt enormous from the inside. From the outside, it barely registered, which meant it would not last forever. A few days later, a small opportunity finally arrived. A local property management company needed temporary office help. The pay was modest. The position lasted only 3 months. But it was work. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early on her first day. The office occupied the ground floor of an aging brick building on the north side of the city. Nothing about it seemed glamorous. Faded carpet, old furniture, fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. Yet when the manager handed her an employee badge, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope. The job involved answering phones, organizing maintenance requests, and processing tenant paperwork. Simple tasks, ordinary responsibilities. Yet Sarah found herself fascinated by the business. Every day she watched managers discuss occupancy rates, rental income, renovation budgets, and operating expenses. She listened carefully. She asked questions when appropriate. More importantly, she paid attention. During lunch breaks, she studied vacant unit reports and maintenance schedules. She discovered that buildings had stories just like people. Some thrived because someone cared for them properly. Others slowly deteriorated because no one paid attention. The concept stayed with her. One rainy Friday evening, Sarah remained at the office after everyone else left. She was organizing files when she noticed a report left on a conference table. The document contained financial information about a small apartment building. Rent collected. Expenses paid. Net income. She stared at the numbers longer than necessary. The building was not luxurious. It was not famous. Yet every month it generated revenue simply because people needed a place to live. A strange thought entered her mind. For years she had viewed buildings as places people occupied. Suddenly she wondered if they were something else entirely. Opportunities. Assets. Futures. The idea seemed almost ridiculous considering her circumstances. She was still sleeping inside her car most nights. She still counted every dollar before buying groceries. Yet the thought refused to disappear. That night she parked beneath a streetlight and opened a notebook she carried in her purse. On the first blank page, she wrote 3 words. Learn this business. Then she stared at the sentence for a long time. Traffic moved through the darkness beyond her windshield. Cold air pressed against the windows. The road ahead remained uncertain. But for the first time since losing everything, Sarah felt as though she was moving toward something rather than simply running from what she had lost. And somewhere across the city, in the apartment building he still called home, Daniel Mitchell had no idea that the woman he believed was broken had just discovered the path that would eventually change both of their lives. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow fell across Chicago in thin white streaks that coated sidewalks, rooftops, and parked cars before sunrise. Sarah Mitchell stood outside the property management office holding a paper cup of coffee between both hands, watching tenants hurry through the cold toward their apartments. Nearly 4 months had passed since the night she lost everything. She no longer slept in her sedan every night. The temporary job had allowed her to rent a small room from an elderly woman on the north side of the city. The space was barely large enough for a twin bed, a dresser, and a folding table, but it had heat, a lock on the door, and a window overlooking a narrow alley. To Sarah, It felt like a mansion. Yet survival remained a daily calculation. Every dollar mattered. Every decision carried consequences. She worked full-time at the office and spent evenings studying everything she could about property management. Books from the library filled her room. Articles covered the folding table. Pages of handwritten notes accumulated inside binders she purchased from a discount store. While other people relaxed after work, Sarah studied occupancy rates, financing structures, maintenance costs, and rental market trends. The information fascinated her. Buildings were no longer just structures made of concrete and steel. They were systems, businesses, opportunities hidden in plain sight. One afternoon, while organizing lease files, Sarah overheard two managers discussing a struggling apartment building on the west side of the city. The property had high vacancy rates, aging units, and financial problems. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it stayed with her the rest of the day. Most people viewed troubled properties as burdens. Sarah found herself wondering if they were something else. Problems waiting for solutions. That evening she sat inside her rented room with a notebook open on her lap. Outside, snow drifted past the window beneath a street lamp. Inside, she made a list of everything she had learned during the previous months. By the time she finished, several pages were filled with observations. For the first time, she realized how much knowledge she had gained. The thought surprised her. Not long ago, she had been focused solely on surviving the next week. Now she was thinking years ahead. Meanwhile, Daniel Mitchell continued living the life she once imagined for both of them. Occasionally his name appeared on social media through mutual acquaintances. Photographs from restaurants, sporting events, business gatherings. Sarah rarely looked for long. The images no longer carried the same sting they once did. What surprised her most was how little she thought about him now. During the early weeks after the divorce, every memory felt sharp enough to reopen old wounds. But time had changed something. Her attention was no longer trapped in the past. It was moving forward. One Saturday afternoon, she attended a free real estate investment seminar hosted inside a community center. Most attendees were older than she was. Many already owned properties. Sarah arrived carrying a notebook and left carrying something far more valuable: perspective. The speakers discussed wealth in a way she had never heard before. They spoke about assets producing income while people slept. They spoke about long-term ownership, patience, compounding growth. As she listened, a strange feeling settled over her. For years, she believed financial security came from finding the right job. Now she began wondering whether true security came from owning something that continued working long after the workday ended. The idea stayed with her for weeks. Every morning she returned to the office with new questions. Every evening, she searched for answers. The managers noticed her curiosity. One of them eventually began explaining reports and financial statements in greater detail. Sarah listened carefully. She always listened carefully, because she understood something most people overlooked. Knowledge was expensive when purchased through mistakes. It was priceless when someone offered it freely. By early spring, the temporary position was extended. Then it became permanent. The raise was small, but the stability mattered. Sarah celebrated by buying herself a new notebook and a modest dinner from a neighborhood diner. Sitting alone in a booth beside the window, she watched people move through the city streets and felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Confidence. Not because her life was easy. It was not. Not because she had succeeded. She had not. But because she could finally see a direction. The road ahead remained long. The destination remained distant. Yet every day she moved closer. And somewhere beneath the noise of traffic, the hum of office buildings, and the endless rhythm of the city, a future was quietly taking shape. Sarah did not know exactly where that future would lead. She only knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woman who had sat alone in a freezing sedan months earlier was slowly disappearing. In her place, someone stronger was beginning to emerge. By the second year, Sarah Mitchell had developed a habit that surprised even her. Every time she entered an apartment building, she stopped seeing walls and hallways. She saw numbers, potential, possibilities hidden behind ordinary doors. The transformation happened gradually, one lesson at a time, one conversation at a time, one long evening of studying after another. Spring sunlight filled the property management office as Sarah sat reviewing maintenance reports. Outside, trees along the street swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, phones rang, tenants submitted requests, and managers discussed budgets. To everyone else, it was an ordinary workday. To Sarah, it was another classroom. She absorbed everything. Every repair estimate, every lease agreement, every vacancy report. The managers had stopped questioning her curiosity months ago. They simply accepted that Sarah wanted to understand how every piece of the business worked. One afternoon, her supervisor asked her to accompany him to inspect a small apartment property on the west side of Chicago. The building was aging and overlooked. The brick exterior showed signs of wear. Several units sat empty. Most investors would have driven past without a second glance. Sarah walked through the hallways carefully. She noticed things others ignored. Good structure, strong location, manageable problems. As she stood in the courtyard listening to traffic in the distance, a realization settled over her. This building was struggling, but it was not broken. It simply needed someone who believed it could become more than it was. The thought followed her home that evening. Inside her rented room, she opened her notebook and filled page after page with observations, numbers, ideas, questions. The notebook that once contained survival plans now contained investment strategies. Sometimes she laughed at the contrast. Less than 2 years earlier, she had been counting dollars to buy groceries. Now she spent evenings studying capitalization rates and rental trends. Yet something about the journey felt natural. Every hardship seemed to have prepared her for this new perspective. Summer arrived, bringing longer days and warmer evenings. Sarah received another promotion at work. The raise was not enormous, but it mattered. More importantly, her responsibilities expanded. She now reviewed operating reports and participated in planning discussions. For the first time, she sat at conference tables where major decisions were made. She rarely spoke unless necessary. Instead, she listened. The most successful people in the room shared a common trait. They thought long-term. While others focused on immediate challenges, they focused on what properties could become 5 years later. Sarah began doing the same. One Friday evening, after leaving the office, she stopped at a small diner she had visited occasionally since her difficult days. Sitting near the window, she watched the city move through the fading light. Construction. Cranes stood against the skyline. New buildings rose beside older ones. Entire neighborhoods evolved over time. Suddenly, she realized something important. Buildings changed. Neighborhoods changed. Lives changed. The future was never fixed. The idea felt powerful. Across town, Daniel Mitchell continued living comfortably. Mutual acquaintances occasionally mentioned promotions, vacations, and social events. Sarah listened politely when his name surfaced, but rarely offered a response. The anger she once carried had faded. Not because she had forgotten what happened, because she no longer wanted her future connected to her past. Every ounce of energy now belonged to the life she was building. Months later, a senior manager handed her a financial package and asked for her opinion. The assignment involved a small, underperforming property. Sarah spent hours reviewing the details. By the time she finished, she had identified opportunities the ownership group overlooked. The manager stared at her analysis for several seconds before smiling. "You have good instincts," he said. The words stayed with her long after the meeting ended. Good instincts. Nobody had said anything like that to her in years. Walking home that evening beneath the glow of city lights, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Confidence was no longer appearing in brief moments. It was becoming permanent. The woman who once searched parking lots for safe places to sleep had become someone capable of seeing value where others saw problems. The city looked different now, not because Chicago had changed, because she had. And somewhere deep inside, a dream that once seemed impossible was quietly beginning to take shape. For the first time, Sarah was not merely learning how buildings worked. She was starting to imagine what it would feel like to own one. The dream remained small at first. Sarah Mitchell never imagined herself owning skyscrapers or appearing on magazine covers. Those fantasies belonged to other people. Her goal was far simpler. She wanted one building, one opportunity, one chance to prove that everything she had learned could become something real. Nearly 3 years had passed since the night she slept inside her sedan. The city outside her apartment window looked different now. Not because Chicago had changed, but because she viewed it through different eyes. The tiny rented room was gone. In its place stood a modest one-bedroom apartment filled with books, notebooks, market reports, and carefully organized files. Every object in the apartment represented progress. Every bill was paid on time. Every dollar had a purpose. Sarah still worked at the property management company, but her responsibilities had expanded significantly. Managers sought her opinion. Owners trusted her analysis. New employees asked questions she once asked herself. Yet despite the growing respect around her, Sarah remained cautious. She knew success could disappear as quickly as it arrived. One afternoon, her supervisor invited her into a conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Sunlight reflected off nearby glass towers, while traffic moved far below. The supervisor slid a file across the table. Inside were details about a small 6-unit apartment building located in an older neighborhood. The owner planned to retire and wanted to sell quickly. The property needed improvements. Several units sat vacant. Most investors considered it too small to attract serious attention. Sarah studied the numbers carefully. Revenue, expenses, occupancy, maintenance costs. As she turned each page, her heartbeat quickened. The building was imperfect, but underneath the problems, she saw potential. More importantly, she understood exactly how to improve it. That night, she spread documents across her kitchen table. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Hours passed unnoticed as she reviewed projections and calculated possibilities. By midnight, the answer became obvious. If she could somehow purchase the property, she knew exactly what to do with it. The problem was simple. She did not have enough money. The realization should have ended the conversation. Instead, it started one. For weeks, Sarah researched financing options. She attended meetings, asked questions, studied lending requirements. Every evening, she returned home with new information and fresh determination. Most people around her had no idea what she was attempting. She preferred it that way. The less attention she attracted, the easier it was to focus. One Saturday morning, she sat across from a local lender in a small office filled with framed photographs and real estate awards. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, Sarah walked outside carrying a folder and a cautious smile. The opportunity was possible. Difficult, but possible. For the first time, the dream felt real. The following months became some of the busiest of her life. She worked full days, studied financial documents at night, and spent weekends inspecting properties and meeting professionals. There were setbacks, delays, moments when the numbers refused to cooperate. More than once she considered walking away. But every time doubt appeared, she remembered the woman who once slept inside a car wondering where tomorrow would come from. Compared to that uncertainty, this challenge felt manageable. Then one crisp autumn afternoon, the phone rang. Sarah stood beside her office window watching leaves drift across the sidewalk below. Her lender's voice carried a calm excitement she immediately recognized. The financing had been approved. For several seconds, she could not speak. The city outside continued moving as usual. Cars stopped at traffic lights. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Nobody noticed that her entire future had just changed. Sarah thanked the lender, ended the call, and remained standing quietly beside the window. She expected celebration. Instead, she felt gratitude. Deep, overwhelming gratitude. Years earlier, she had been searching for a safe parking lot. Now she was preparing to purchase her first apartment building. The distance between those two moments seemed impossible to measure. Closing day arrived several weeks later. The building itself looked exactly as it had during her first inspection. Weathered brick, aging hallways, empty units waiting for attention. Yet when Sarah received the keys, everything felt different. The metal felt cool in her hand. Ordinary keys. Extraordinary meaning. She walked through the property alone that evening. The setting sun cast long shadows across vacant apartments. Dust floated through golden beams of light. Somewhere in the distance, traffic hummed through the city streets. Sarah paused in the center of an empty living room and looked around. The space needed work. The building needed care. But for the first time in years, she was no longer studying someone else's future. She was standing inside her own. And although she did not know it yet, the small 6-unit building would become the foundation for something far greater than she had ever imagined. Owning the building changed Sarah Mitchell in ways she never expected. The transformation had nothing to do with money. It came from responsibility. Every morning began with decisions. Maintenance requests, tenant concerns, budget reviews, contractor estimates. Problems arrived daily, and for the first time, they belonged to her. During the first few months, she spent countless hours walking through hallways, inspecting units, and meeting residents. Some tenants had lived there for years. Others had recently moved in. Most never imagined the owner of the property was a woman who had once slept inside her car less than 4 years earlier. Sarah preferred it that way. She was not interested in impressing anyone. She wanted the building to succeed. One rainy afternoon, she stood beside a second-floor window watching contractors replace damaged flooring in a vacant unit. The scent of fresh paint drifted through the hallway. Outside, water rolled down the brick exterior in silver streams. The building already looked different. Cleaner, brighter, more cared for. Small improvements created noticeable changes. Occupancy slowly increased. Maintenance costs became more predictable. Tenant satisfaction improved. Every positive result reinforced something Sarah had learned long ago. Success rarely arrived through dramatic moments. It arrived through consistent effort repeated over time. By the end of the first year, the property was performing better than anyone expected. Financial reports reflected steady growth. Vacancy rates dropped significantly. Several residents renewed their leases. One elderly tenant even stopped Sarah in the courtyard to thank her for fixing issues that previous owners ignored for years. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet Sarah thought about it for days afterward. Because for the first time, ownership felt personal. These were not merely numbers on a spreadsheet. These were people's homes, their lives, their futures. The experience deepened her understanding of real estate in ways no seminar ever could. Soon another opportunity appeared. Then another. Investors she met through work began approaching her with questions and proposals. A small partnership formed around a second property acquisition. The building was larger than the first and required more extensive improvements. Many people considered the risk too high. Sarah recognized the same pattern she had seen before. Neglect hiding potential. She joined the project. The following years passed quickly. Seasons changed. Chicago winters arrived and disappeared. Construction projects began and ended. New tenants moved in while others moved away. Sarah's portfolio slowly expanded. Not through luck, through patience, careful decisions, relentless learning. The process never felt glamorous. Most days involved meetings, inspections, financial reviews, and problem solving. Yet she loved every part of it. Because each challenge reminded her how far she had traveled from that cold parking lot years earlier. One evening, nearly 7 years after the divorce, Sarah stood inside her office overlooking the city skyline. The company she founded occupied an entire floor of a renovated downtown building. Through the windows, the lights of Chicago stretched toward the horizon. Traffic moved below like streams of light. The view was beautiful, yet what captured her attention was a photograph sitting on her desk. It showed a much younger version of herself standing beside an aging sedan. The image had been taken accidentally by a friend during one of the hardest periods of her life. She kept it as a reminder, not of suffering, of resilience. Her phone interrupted the moment. A member of her acquisitions team called with news about a potential opportunity. Sarah listened quietly while details were explained. Location, occupancy, ownership structure, asking price. At first, the information sounded routine. Then one detail caused her to pause. The address. She walked slowly toward the window while the caller continued speaking. The building was familiar, extremely familiar. She remembered the lobby, the elevators, the view from the upper floors. Years ago, she had carried 2 suitcases through those hallways for the last time. The property where Daniel Mitchell still lived had quietly been placed on the market. Sarah remained silent for several seconds after the call ended. The city lights reflected across the glass in front of her. Somewhere in that enormous skyline stood a building connected to another version of her life. A chapter she believed had closed forever. Yet now, unexpectedly, the story had found its way back. She felt no anger, no bitterness, only curiosity. The acquisition team wanted her opinion by the following week. Sarah looked out across the city one more time before turning away from the window. Years ago, she had lost a home. Now she was being asked whether she wanted to buy an entire building. And somewhere beneath the quiet excitement of the moment, fate seemed to be preparing something neither she nor Daniel could possibly anticipate. The address remained on Sarah Mitchell's desk for 3 days. Not because the acquisition was unusually complicated. Not because the financial projections raised concerns. The numbers were actually strong. Occupancy remained high. The location was excellent. The building generated consistent revenue and possessed long-term value. By every objective measure, It was the type of investment her company routinely pursued. Yet every time Sarah looked at the property file, memories surfaced. She remembered the 8th-floor hallway, the polished lobby floors, the elevators she once rode every morning. Most of all, she remembered carrying 2 suitcases through the front entrance on the final day of her marriage while trying not to look back. 7 years had passed since then, long enough for the pain to fade, long enough for an entirely different life to emerge. Yet certain places never completely lost their connection to the past. On a cool Thursday morning, Sarah joined her acquisitions team inside a conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Financial reports covered the table. Market projections appeared on a large screen. The discussion remained professional and focused. Revenue growth, capital improvements, tenant retention, long-term appreciation. Nobody else in the room knew the personal history attached to the property. To them, it was simply another potential acquisition. Sarah preferred it that way. She listened carefully as each team member presented their analysis. The conclusion was unanimous. The building represented an excellent opportunity. By the end of the meeting, Sarah approved moving forward with negotiations. The decision felt surprisingly simple. Not emotional, not dramatic, just business. Later that afternoon, she visited the property alone. The city hummed around her as she stepped from her car and looked up at the familiar structure. The building appeared smaller than she remembered. Perhaps success had changed her perspective, or perhaps time had softened the significance of the place itself. People entered and exited the lobby carrying groceries, briefcases, and coffee cups. Ordinary lives unfolding inside an ordinary building. Sarah smiled slightly. Years earlier, she had viewed the property as a symbol of everything she lost. Now it looked like what it had always been: real estate. She entered through the front doors. The scent of polished wood and fresh flowers greeted her immediately. Little had changed. The marble flooring remained. The front desk occupied the same position. Even the lighting felt familiar. Yet the emotions she expected never arrived. There was no anger, no sadness, no bitterness. Instead, she felt gratitude, because standing there reminded her how far she had traveled. A leasing manager escorted her through several common areas while discussing maintenance schedules and resident demographics. Sarah asked questions and reviewed records. Her attention remained focused on the property itself, until the elevator doors opened unexpectedly. A man stepped into the lobby carrying a gym bag. For a brief moment, neither person moved. Daniel Mitchell stopped walking. Sarah felt time slow almost imperceptibly. 7 years had changed both of them. Daniel's hair carried traces of gray now. His face looked older, more serious. Sarah knew she had changed as well. The uncertainty that once defined her expression had disappeared long ago. They stood several feet apart, surrounded by the quiet movement of daily life. Residents passed by. Conversations continued. Yet the moment felt strangely isolated from everything around it. Daniel stared for several seconds before speaking. "Sarah?" His voice carried genuine surprise. Sarah nodded politely. "Hello, Daniel." He looked around as if trying to understand why she was there. "I had no idea you were here." "Business meeting," she replied calmly. The answer was truthful. Daniel glanced toward the leasing manager standing nearby. Confusion flickered briefly across his face before disappearing. "You look well," he said. Sarah smiled. "Thank you." The conversation lasted less than a minute. No confrontation, no accusations, no discussion of the past. Eventually, Daniel excused himself and continued toward the elevators. Sarah watched the doors close behind him. Then she returned to the property tour. Yet something had changed. Not in the building. In herself. Years earlier, she imagined meeting Daniel again and proving something. Showing him what she became. Demonstrating everything he underestimated. But standing there now, she realized she no longer needed validation. The life she built spoke for itself. A few weeks later, negotiations accelerated. Lawyers exchanged documents. Financial reviews concluded. The seller accepted final terms. The acquisition moved steadily toward completion. Throughout the process, Daniel remained completely unaware of what was happening. He knew Sarah had been visiting the building. He did not know why. He certainly did not know that ownership was quietly changing hands. One crisp autumn evening, Sarah sat alone in her office watching the city lights emerge across the skyline. A final set of documents rested on her desk awaiting signatures. Outside the windows, Chicago stretched endlessly into the distance. Somewhere among those lights stood a building. connected to her past. Soon, very soon, it would become part of her future. And neither Sarah nor Daniel yet understood how extraordinary that moment would become. The closing documents arrived on a Monday morning. Sarah Mitchell reviewed every page from the quiet corner of her office while sunlight poured across the hardwood floor. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago moved with its usual rhythm. Cars flowed through intersections. Construction cranes stretched above the skyline. People hurried toward meetings and appointments without realizing that an ordinary business transaction was about to become something far more meaningful. The acquisition had taken months of negotiations, inspections, legal reviews, and financial analysis. Yet now everything came down to a stack of papers and a signature. Sarah read each page carefully despite already knowing every detail. Habit had taught her that success often depended upon the details others overlooked. When she finally signed the last document, there was no dramatic celebration, no applause, no grand announcement, just a quiet sense of completion. The building officially became part of her company's portfolio. Sarah set the pen down and looked out across the city. Years ago, she had left that same property carrying 2 suitcases and an uncertain future. Now she owned it. The thought felt surreal. Not because of Daniel, not because of the past, because of the journey itself. Later that week, the transition team prepared communication materials for residents. Ownership changes happened regularly throughout the real estate industry. Most tenants rarely paid attention. As long as the elevators worked and the lights stayed on, few people cared who owned the building. Sarah understood that. She instructed her team to focus on stability. No major rent increases. No dramatic policy changes. No unnecessary disruptions. The building would continue operating as it always had. If anything, residents would benefit from additional improvements planned over the coming years. Several executives suggested announcing the acquisition through a formal event. Sarah declined. She preferred results over publicity. Yet one recommendation caught her attention. The property management company proposed hosting a resident meeting to introduce ownership and answer questions. The suggestion made sense. Transparency built trust. Sarah agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the following month. Across town, Daniel Mitchell received the notice along with every other resident. He skimmed the document while standing in his kitchen and immediately set it aside. Building ownership changed. Management companies changed. None of it seemed particularly important. He had attended enough resident meetings over the years to know they were usually brief and forgettable. What captured his attention instead was an unexpected memory. The encounter with Sarah several weeks earlier continued returning to him at odd moments. He could not fully explain why. Perhaps because she appeared different. Not merely older, stronger, more confident. The uncertainty that once characterized her presence had vanished completely. During quiet evenings, he occasionally wondered what her life looked like now. Yet the thoughts never lasted long. Life moved forward. Responsibilities demanded attention. The questions remained unanswered. Meanwhile, Sarah visited the property several times during the transition period. She reviewed maintenance reports, renovation plans, and operating budgets. Employees greeted her respectfully. Contractors discussed upcoming projects. Everything proceeded smoothly. During one inspection, she stepped onto the 8th floor and found herself standing in the hallway where she once lived. The corridor looked exactly as she remembered. Soft lighting, neutral carpeting, quiet doors lining both sides. Time seemed strangely compressed. For a brief moment, the years between then and now disappeared. Sarah remembered carrying those suitcases toward the elevator. She remembered wondering how she would survive. She remembered believing her future had been destroyed. Standing there now, she smiled softly. Life had answered those fears in ways she never imagined. A maintenance supervisor approached with questions about upcoming improvements, pulling her back into the present. Sarah turned and continued walking down the hallway. The past remained behind her, exactly where it belonged. As the resident meeting approached, preparations continued. Invitations were distributed. Seating arrangements were finalized. Presentation materials were organized. The event itself appeared completely routine. Yet beneath the surface, something unusual was taking shape. Neither the residents nor the property staff understood the significance of the gathering. Most importantly, Daniel remained unaware. He planned to attend simply because the notice recommended it. Nothing more. On the evening before the meeting, Sarah stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. The city glowed beneath the darkness like a field of stars. Reflections shimmered across the glass while traffic moved through the streets below. Her phone displayed the meeting agenda. One final item appeared near the bottom. Introduction of ownership. Sarah stared at those words for several seconds before setting the phone aside. She felt no desire for revenge. No need to embarrass anyone. The meeting was business. Nothing more. Yet somewhere across the city, a man who once believed he understood how her story ended was preparing to walk into a room where he would discover just how wrong he had been. The resident meeting began on a cool Wednesday evening just after sunset. Soft lighting illuminated the community room on the first floor, while residents gradually filled rows of neatly arranged chairs. Conversations drifted through the air. Some people discussed maintenance requests. Others talked about parking assignments, package deliveries, and recent renovations. For most attendees, it was another routine meeting in a building they called home. Daniel Mitchell arrived a few minutes early carrying a cup of coffee. He greeted several neighbors before taking a seat near the middle of the room. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual. A small table stood near the front beside a projector screen displaying information about upcoming improvements. Property managers moved between rows, answering questions and organizing materials. Daniel glanced around casually. He expected the meeting to last less than an hour. Across the city, Sarah Mitchell prepared to leave her office. The skyline glowed beneath the deep blue of early evening. Inside her office, floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city lights stretching toward the horizon. Her assistant reviewed the agenda one final time while gathering presentation materials. Everything had been carefully organized. Renovation schedules, budget allocations, planned upgrades. Sarah listened quietly before standing and collecting her jacket. The meeting itself was not particularly important from a business perspective. Her company owned multiple properties. Acquisitions occurred regularly. Yet something about this evening felt different. Perhaps because certain journeys occasionally circle back to where they began. The drive across Chicago took less than 30 minutes. Traffic moved steadily beneath streetlights while the city shifted from office towers to residential neighborhoods. Sarah spent most of the drive looking through the window. Memories appeared occasionally, but never lingered. The past no longer held power over her. It simply existed. A chapter completed long ago. When she arrived, several members of the property management team greeted her near the entrance. Residents continued gathering inside the community room. The atmosphere remained relaxed, comfortable, ordinary. Sarah reviewed a few final details before waiting in a nearby office while the meeting officially began. Inside the community room, the property manager welcomed everyone and reviewed routine updates, maintenance projects, landscaping improvements, security enhancements. Residents listened politely. Some took notes. Others checked their phones. Daniel paid partial attention while sipping coffee. Everything seemed exactly as expected. Then the manager reached the final item on the agenda. Before we conclude, he announced, we would like to formally introduce the ownership group responsible for the building's recent acquisition. Several residents looked up with mild curiosity. Ownership changes were rarely exciting. Daniel barely reacted. He assumed some investment executive would step forward, shake hands, and deliver a brief speech. The property manager smiled toward the doorway. Please join me in welcoming our owner. Every conversation stopped. The room turned toward the entrance. Sarah stepped inside. The reaction was subtle at first. A few residents simply recognized a professional woman entering the room. Others glanced toward the front without much interest. Then Daniel looked up. His coffee cup froze halfway to the table. For a moment, he genuinely believed he was mistaken. The woman walking toward the front of the room could not possibly be Sarah. Yet it was. The same calm expression. The same steady confidence he noticed during their recent encounter. Only now she stood beside the property manager while dozens of residents watched. Silence spread slowly across the room. Sarah thanked everyone for attending and began speaking about the future of the property. Her voice remained warm and professional. She discussed long-term improvements, resident experience, maintenance standards, and community investment. There was no mention of personal history, no reference to the past, nothing except business. Yet Daniel heard almost none of it. One realization repeated itself inside his mind. Sarah owned the building, not a unit, not an office, the entire building. The realization felt impossible. Years earlier, he watched her leave with almost nothing. He remembered the uncertainty in her eyes, the financial struggles, the difficult months after the divorce. Somewhere between then and now, an entirely different story had unfolded. Around the room, several residents nodded approvingly while listening to the presentation. Sarah answered questions thoughtfully. She spoke with the confidence of someone who understood every detail of the business, every decision, every plan. Daniel watched quietly. The contrast between memory and reality felt overwhelming. The woman standing at the front of the room was not rebuilding her life anymore. She had already rebuilt it. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Eventually, applause filled the room as residents thanked ownership for planned improvements and transparent communication. Sarah smiled politely before stepping down from the front. Residents approached to introduce themselves and ask additional questions. Daniel remained seated for several seconds longer. Across the room, Sarah spoke with tenants who had no idea they were witnessing the final stage of a transformation years in the making. And for the first time since the divorce, Daniel began to understand that the story he thought he knew had never been the whole story at all. The community room gradually emptied after the meeting ended. Residents gathered their belongings, exchanged conversations about upcoming improvements, and drifted toward elevators and hallways. The atmosphere remained positive. Most people seemed genuinely encouraged by the plan Sarah Mitchell had presented. To them, the evening represented a simple introduction to new ownership. To Daniel Mitchell, it felt like something entirely different. He remained seated longer than necessary, watching the last few residents leave. Across the room, Sarah continued speaking with tenants who approached her one after another. She answered questions patiently. Maintenance concerns, renovation schedules, community programs. Every response reflected confidence and experience. Daniel found himself studying her from a distance. Not because she owned the building, because he suddenly realized how little he knew about the years that followed their divorce. At some point, he had assumed her story stopped where his memories ended. The assumption now seemed embarrassingly incomplete. Eventually, the room grew quiet. Property managers collected materials while staff members packed equipment. Sarah thanked several employees before gathering her notes. As she turned toward the exit, she noticed Daniel standing nearby. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The silence felt different from the silence they once shared years ago. Back then it carried frustration, distance, unspoken resentment. Now it carried perspective. Daniel broke it first. "Congratulations," he said. The words sounded genuine. Sarah offered a small smile. "Thank you." He glanced around the room. "I did not know." The statement seemed inadequate the moment it left his mouth. Sarah understood anyway. "Most people did not," she replied. Daniel nodded. Slowly, through the glass entrance doors, city lights reflected across the lobby floor. Outside, evening traffic moved steadily along nearby streets. Everything felt strangely calm. "You have done very well for yourself," he said. Sarah looked toward the lobby for a moment before answering. "I have been fortunate." Daniel almost laughed. Not because the response was funny, because it sounded exactly like something she would say. Years earlier, even during difficult times, she never took credit for more than necessary. The humility remained unchanged. "I do not think fortune explains all of it," he said quietly. Sarah did not respond immediately. She simply smiled and adjusted the folder she carried beneath her arm. Daniel noticed something then. She no longer seemed interested in proving anything. Not to him. Not to anyone. The realization affected him more than he expected. If she had arrived seeking revenge, he could have understood it. If she wanted recognition, it would have made sense. Instead, she appeared completely at peace, as though the past had already released its hold on her long ago. They walked together toward the lobby. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor. Years earlier, they had walked through the same space as husband and wife. Now they moved through it as two entirely different people. Near the entrance, Daniel stopped. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded. "Of course." He hesitated briefly. "When did all of this happen?" Sarah looked toward the city beyond the glass doors. "Slowly," she answered. The simplicity of the response caught him off guard. "That is it." She smiled. "Most important things happen slowly." Daniel stood quietly. The answer felt incomplete and yet somehow perfect. Because standing beside her now, he could see the truth in it. There had been no miracle, no sudden transformation, just years of work nobody witnessed, years of learning, Years of persistence. Years of refusing to quit. The realization settled heavily in his thoughts. Sarah glanced at her watch. I should get going. Right, Daniel replied. Neither moved immediately. Then something unexpected happened. I am glad things worked out for you, he said. The statement carried none of the awkwardness he feared. It sounded honest. Sarah studied him for a moment. Thank you, Daniel. No bitterness. No triumph. Just gratitude. She stepped through the doors and disappeared into the evening. Daniel remained inside the lobby, watching her walk toward a waiting car. The city lights illuminated the sidewalk around her. For a brief moment, he remembered another night many years earlier. Rain. Suitcases. Uncertainty. He remembered believing that chapter represented an ending. Standing there now, he understood something he should have realized long ago. Endings rarely look the way people expect. Sometimes they become beginnings instead. Over the following days, Daniel found himself noticing changes throughout the building. Maintenance teams responded faster. Common areas received upgrades. Residents spoke positively about management. Every improvement reminded him of the meeting. More importantly, every improvement reminded him of Sarah. Not because she owned the property, because she cared about it. The same attention she once gave to every responsibility in her life now shaped an entire portfolio of buildings. One evening, he stood near the 8th-floor window overlooking the city. The skyline stretched across the darkness exactly as it had years before. Yet everything felt different. Somewhere among those lights, Sarah was continuing to build a future she created entirely on her own. And for the first time, Daniel understood that her greatest achievement was never buying a building. It was becoming someone who no longer needed anyone else's permission to succeed. Autumn slowly gave way to winter, and the building continued to change under Sarah Mitchell's ownership. Fresh landscaping appeared near the entrance. Hallways received updated lighting. Common areas felt brighter and more welcoming. None of the improvements were extravagant. They reflected the same philosophy Sarah applied throughout her career. Small details, handled consistently, eventually transformed everything. Residents noticed. Conversations in elevators became more positive. Maintenance requests were resolved faster. New tenants arrived through recommendations from existing ones. The building felt less like a collection of apartments and more like a community. One snowy evening, Sarah visited the property after reviewing progress reports with her management team. Large snowflakes drifted through the glow of streetlights while traffic moved slowly along the wet streets. Inside the lobby, holiday decorations stood near the front desk. Soft music played quietly through speakers overhead. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. Sarah spent nearly an hour walking through common areas and speaking with staff members. Before leaving, she stopped near the mailboxes to review a renovation update. Sarah? The voice came from behind her. She turned and saw Daniel standing several feet away holding a small package. He looked surprised but not entirely shocked. Their paths had crossed enough recently that chance meetings no longer felt impossible. Hello, Daniel, she said. He smiled. I feel like I keep running into you lately. Sarah laughed softly. Occupational hazard. The simple joke eased whatever awkwardness remained between them. Daniel glanced around the lobby. The place looks great. The team deserves most of the credit, Sarah replied. They have worked very hard. Again, Daniel noticed the same pattern. She always shared credit. Always redirected praise. Some things truly never changed. Snow continued falling outside while residents moved through the lobby carrying groceries and shopping bags. The building felt alive. Comfortable. Daniel looked around before speaking again. People are happy here. Sarah followed his gaze. That matters to me. The answer sounded simple, yet Daniel sensed something deeper behind it. Why, he asked. Sarah considered the question for a moment. Because everyone deserves to feel secure where they live. The words settled quietly between them. Daniel looked toward the elevators. He understood immediately that she was talking about far more than property management. Sarah was not discussing leases or maintenance requests. She was speaking from experience. Years ago, she knew exactly what it felt like to lose that sense of security. Neither mentioned the past directly. They did not need to. The silence carried enough understanding on its own. You built something remarkable, Daniel said finally. Sarah smiled politely. It took time. More than that. His voice remained calm. It took determination. Sarah did not answer immediately. Through the glass entrance doors, snow covered the sidewalks in a growing blanket of white. Cars moved slowly through the storm. The city looked peaceful. Life teaches lessons, she said eventually. The difficult part is deciding whether to learn from them. Daniel nodded. The statement stayed with him long after she spoke it. Because he realized she had spent years learning, while he spent years assuming he already understood everything. They talked for a few more minutes before Sarah excused herself. Several managers were waiting upstairs to review upcoming projects. Daniel watched her enter the elevator and disappear behind closing doors. The lobby suddenly felt quieter. Over the following weeks, thoughts about Sarah returned more frequently. Not because he wanted to revisit the past, because he found himself respecting the person she became. He began asking mutual acquaintances about her company. The answers surprised him. Multiple properties, successful developments, community partnerships, charitable housing initiatives. Every new detail expanded a picture he never expected to see. The transformation had not happened overnight. It happened one decision at a time, 1 year at a time, one challenge at a time. Meanwhile, Sarah remained focused on the future. New opportunities continued appearing across Chicago. Investors sought partnerships. Lenders offered financing. Industry conferences invited her to speak. Success created momentum, and momentum created even more opportunities. Yet despite everything she achieved, she still kept the same photograph inside her office. The one showing her old sedan from years ago. The image remained a reminder that gratitude mattered more than success. One afternoon, while preparing for a board meeting, Sarah received a handwritten note from an elderly resident in the building. The message thanked ownership for creating an environment where people felt respected and valued. The note occupied less than half a page. Yet Sarah read it 3 times before placing it carefully inside her desk drawer. Because moments like that meant more than financial reports ever could. Late that evening, as snow fell gently beyond her office windows, she looked out across the city skyline. Thousands of lights stretched into the darkness. Somewhere among them stood the building that once represented loss and now represented growth. The irony was impossible to ignore. Yet Sarah no longer viewed the property as proof of how far she had come. She viewed it as proof of something even more important. The worst chapter of a person's life does not have to become the final chapter. Sometimes it becomes the reason a better story begins. Spring arrived quietly across Chicago. Snow disappeared from sidewalks. Trees regained their color. Outdoor cafes reopened beneath clear skies. Life moved forward with the steady confidence that always seemed to accompany warmer weather. For Sarah Mitchell, the season brought another wave of growth. Several development projects entered new phases. Property acquisitions progressed through negotiations. Community partnerships expanded into additional neighborhoods. Her calendar remained full from morning until evening, yet she still reserved time each week to personally visit the building that unexpectedly reconnected her with the past. Residents often greeted her by name now. Maintenance staff updated her during walkthroughs. Managers shared feedback about improvements and future plans. The property no longer represented a business transaction. It had become one of her favorite communities. One Saturday afternoon, a resident appreciation event filled the courtyard with activity. Families gathered around picnic tables. Children played games beneath bright spring sunlight. Local musicians performed near the entrance while food vendors served lunch. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. Sarah arrived midway through the event and spent much of the afternoon speaking with residents. She listened more than she talked. Stories, suggestions, concerns, hopes for future improvements. Those conversations always mattered to her because they reminded her why she entered the business in the first place. Buildings were important. People mattered more. Near the edge of the courtyard, Daniel Mitchell watched the gathering while holding a paper cup of coffee. The event had drawn a larger crowd than expected. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another were laughing together. Families lingered longer than planned. The building felt less like an apartment complex and more like a neighborhood. Daniel knew exactly who deserved the credit. As the afternoon continued, he noticed something interesting. Residents gravitated naturally towards Sarah. Not because she owned the property, because they trusted her. Elderly tenants thanked her for improvements. Young families shared positive experiences. Staff members spoke about her leadership with genuine respect. None of it appeared rehearsed. None of it felt performative. It was simply the result of years spent treating people well. The realization stayed with Daniel throughout the event. Later that evening, After most residents had gone home, Sarah remained behind reviewing cleanup plans with management staff. The courtyard had grown quiet. Folding tables were being removed. Decorative lights flickered gently overhead as sunset painted the sky with shades of gold and orange. Daniel happened to pass through the area on his way back from a nearby restaurant. When their eyes met, both smiled. The interactions between them had become easier over time, more natural, less defined by history. "Looks like the event was a success," Daniel said. Sarah glanced around the courtyard. "I think people enjoyed themselves." "They did." He paused briefly. "You have created something special here." Sarah looked towards several employees finishing their work nearby. "A lot of people helped make it happen." Daniel laughed softly. "There you go again." "What?" she asked. "Giving everyone else credit." Sarah smiled but said nothing. The observation was accurate. Some habits never changed. The sky gradually darkened while city lights appeared beyond nearby buildings. Evening settled gently over the neighborhood. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, not awkward. Just two people sharing a quiet moment after a long day. "Can I tell you something?" Daniel asked eventually. Sarah nodded. "Of course." He looked toward the courtyard before continuing. "For a long time, I thought success meant having the right title, the right apartment, the right income." His voice remained calm, thoughtful. "But watching what you built has made me realize something." Sarah listened quietly. "What is that?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Success is creating something that improves other people's lives." The words lingered in the evening air. Sarah looked at him for several seconds before responding. "That is a lesson some people spend their whole lives trying to learn." Daniel nodded. He understood that now, more than ever. Across the city skyline, lights illuminated thousands of windows. Somewhere inside those buildings, people worried about careers, finances, relationships, and uncertain futures. Sarah knew that feeling well. She had lived it. Perhaps that was why she never forgot where she started. As darkness settled fully across Chicago, the conversation eventually ended. Daniel headed toward the entrance, while Sarah prepared to leave with her team. Yet before walking away, she paused and looked once more across the courtyard. Families had laughed there earlier. Children had played there. Neighbors had connected there. None of those moments would appear in financial reports. None would increase property valuations. Yet somehow they mattered most. Because years ago she lost a place to call home. Now she spent her life helping create that feeling for others. And standing beneath the glow of courtyard lights, Sarah realized that no acquisition, investment, or business achievement could ever feel more meaningful than that. Several months later, summer returned to Chicago. Warm sunlight reflected from glass towers downtown, while sailboats drifted across Lake Michigan beneath a clear blue sky. The city looked vibrant, alive, full of movement and possibility. From her office window, Sarah Mitchell watched the skyline stretch toward the horizon and thought about how strange life could be. Years ago, she had sat alone inside an aging sedan wondering how she would survive the next week. Now she stood at the head of a company responsible for thousands of residents, multiple communities, and projects that would continue shaping neighborhoods long after she was gone. Yet the achievement that brought her the greatest sense of peace had nothing to do with business. It was the simple realization that she no longer carried the weight of the past. One afternoon, she visited the building again for a routine inspection. The courtyard was full of life. Residents talked beneath shaded seating areas. Flowers bloomed along carefully maintained walkways. Children laughed near a small community garden that had been added during recent renovations. Everything felt warm and welcoming. As Sarah walked through the property, she noticed something she once would have missed. People looked comfortable, secure, at home. The feeling brought a quiet smile to her face. Near the entrance, she encountered Daniel Mitchell. He had just returned from work and was carrying a briefcase. Their meetings no longer felt surprising. Time had transformed awkward encounters into simple conversations. "Good afternoon," Daniel said. "Beautiful day." "It is," Sarah replied. For a moment, they stood together watching residents move through the courtyard. Neither seemed in a hurry to leave. Eventually, Daniel looked around and smiled. "You know, I still find it hard to believe." Sarah laughed softly. "Believe what?" "How much everything changed." His eyes moved across the property. "Not just the building. Everything." Sarah followed his gaze. The answer came easily. Change has a way of arriving one day at a time until suddenly it looks impossible. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That sounds exactly like something you would say. They both laughed. The conversation felt light, easy, free from old wounds, free from old expectations. After a few moments, Daniel turned serious. There is something I have wanted to tell you. Sarah listened quietly. Years ago, I thought losing something meant the story was over. He paused briefly. Watching your life unfold taught me otherwise. The honesty in his voice was impossible to miss. Sarah considered his words carefully. Sometimes losing something forces us to become someone new. Daniel smiled. I think you became exactly who you were supposed to be. The statement lingered between them. Not as praise, not as regret, simply as truth. A warm breeze moved through the courtyard. Nearby trees swayed gently beneath the afternoon sun. Around them, life continued normally. Residents walked dogs. Neighbors exchanged greetings. Children chased one another across the grass. The scene felt almost cinematic in its simplicity. Eventually, Daniel glanced at his watch and prepared to leave. Before walking away, he stopped and looked back. For what it is worth, I am happy for you. Sarah smiled. Thank you. Then he disappeared into the building. Sarah remained standing in the courtyard for several seconds longer. The conversation left her thoughtful, not because it reopened old memories, because it confirmed something she had understood for a long time. Closure was not an event. It was a process. It arrived quietly, gradually, often without announcement. Later that evening, after returning to her office, Sarah opened the drawer containing the photograph she had carried through every stage of her journey. The image showed the old sedan beneath parking lot lights, a symbol of uncertainty, fear, survival. She studied the photograph one final time. Then she carefully placed it inside a storage box containing other personal memories. The picture had served its purpose. She no longer needed daily reminders of where she started. The lessons would remain with her forever. As sunset painted the skyline gold and orange, Sarah walked toward the windows overlooking the city. Thousands of lights would soon appear across Chicago. Thousands of stories unfolding simultaneously. Some people were beginning difficult chapters. Others were living through endings they never wanted. Many were standing exactly where she once stood, unable to imagine a brighter future. Sarah wished she could tell them what she had learned. That pain is temporary. That dignity survives hardship. That the worst day of your life does not get to decide the rest of your life. But perhaps the city already knew. Perhaps every illuminated window contained its own version of that lesson. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. Sarah watched the final light fade from the skyline and felt a deep sense of peace settle around her. She never bought that building to prove a point. She never rebuilt her life for revenge. She simply kept moving forward when stopping would have been easier. And in the end, that made all the difference. Because the greatest victory was never the building. It was becoming someone who could stand in the same place where everything once fell apart and feel nothing but gratitude. Years ago, he believed her story had ended. But she knew something he did not. Sometimes the chapter that looks like an ending is only the beginning of everything that comes next.